Okay, so good evening and welcome back everyone to the 15th Annual Information Security Summit 2020 brought to you by NASSCOM DSCI. Our event technology partner is Infosys Meridian. So that was a very short break that we took, and we are now going to resume with our keynote sessions. And without wasting any time, let me introduce you to our first speaker for this keynote session. We have with us Mr. Steve Ledzian, who is the CTO APAC for FireEye. And Steve, welcome. And he's going to be talking to us about ransomware turns vicious, evolving trends. So over to you, Steve.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining the session. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you so much to DSCI and the organizers for facilitating this all. I'd like to talk to you about ransomware. And I know we've heard about ransomware ad nauseum already, but really ransomware has changed in just the last year. And it's really important to understand these changes. And so I'd like to walk you through them so you can anticipate what ransomware will look like in 2021. But first, we need to understand a little bit about some TTPs, or tactics, techniques, and procedures. We all know that information is meant to be private. And one of the things that hackers will sometimes do is something called hack and leak, meaning they break into a network, they steal information, and then they make that information that they've stolen public for various reasons. We've seen sites like WikiLeaks do things like this. And in 2016, there was the US election, which suffered a hack and leak attack. And the following year, in 2017, we saw a similar attack against the French election, right? So these sorts of hack and leak techniques, they've really been the domain of espionage actors, nation state actors, not so much cyber criminals, right? The espionage actors are motivated by nation state initiatives. The cyber crime or the financial actors are motivated, of course, by money. So the cybercrime actors, specifically the ransomware actors, have now taken a play from the playbook of the cyber espionage actors and are entering this domain of hack and leak with ransomware, which is something that's relatively new. To understand this, to understand how attackers accomplish this, we have to understand that ransomware is changing. The old way of doing ransomware was very malware-based, right? So what would happen is the attackers would spam out lots of messages with malicious attachments or malicious links, and those would ultimately point to ransomware. And when someone, unfortunate person, opened the attachment or opened the link, that machine where they were reading email would get infected with ransomware. Well, the attackers realized that these machines where they're reading email, they aren't very big targets. They wanted to aim for larger targets. And in order to do this, they had to change how they attack. They first now intrude. There's a full intrusion into the network before the manual deployment of ransomware. We call this post-compromise ransomware. So instead of mailing the ransomware, they mail a backdoor. And the backdoor allows them entry into the network. And once in the network, they can find the important business servers. And they can manually deploy the ransomware on those business servers. And when they do this, it's actually a double dose of extortion, because we have the traditional impact of ransomware, which is what? Your files are encrypted and you can't access them. But what attackers have figured out is, wait a minute, if I've already broken into the network and I'm already on the critical business servers and I'm about to deploy ransomware, I'm at the data. Why don't I just first steal the data first before deploying the ransomware? And then I can do hack and leak, or a threat to hack and leak. And so now it's a double extortion. The victims can't access their data, which is painful enough, but they're now also under pressure that the attacker is threatening to take that stolen data and make it public. And that adds to the leverage that the attacker has when they're demanding these types of extortions. And so this is how modern ransomware operates today. The attacker first breaks into a network, they find the important data, they steal that important data, they then encrypt that important data with ransomware, and then they extort the victim with threats to make that important data public, right? And that's becoming more and more the default with the ransomware attacks we're seeing in 2020 and what we anticipate for 2021. So let's take a look at how this is different, right? And let's start by the attack timing. With standard ransomware, where they're emailing the ransomware out, the attacker doesn't control the timing. When does the ransomware fire? The ransomware triggers whenever the victim opens that attachment or follows the link. So the attacker is not in control. But with post-compromise ransomware, where they first break into the network, the attacker is in control. They're in control of the exact timing. So we've seen attackers do this, right before exams in universities, or you can imagine they do it on, 5 p.m. on a Friday, the most inopportune time. And that adds to the pain of the attack. The target, right? With standard ransomware, it's whatever machine you were happening to read email on. It's a random machine. But with post-compromise ransomware, the attackers are deploying on critical servers. And not just one, but multiple servers simultaneously. Disclosure, right? Sometimes when organizations are the victim of a cyber attack, they don't want that information to come to light, right? And so the victim in a standard ransomware attack, they control the disclosure. But in a post-compromise attack, it's the attacker who controls the disclosure. The attacker has the data, the attacker is threatening to make that data public, and they are the ones to decide whether or not that data becomes public. So the attacker is in control of the disclosure of the breach. What about monetary costs? Well, legal penalties are unlikely for a standard ransomware because it's just a service disruption. But for post-compromise ransomware, if you have a leak of data, well, then you might have PII issues, right? And so there may be legal penalties, regulatory fines, not so much for standard ransomware, but for post-compromise ransomware, very likely. And reputation costs, right? So there might be some moderate amount of reputation if you lose a period of service through the service disruption of encrypted files. But the reputation costs can be a lot higher if you lose your customers' data or your partners, your business partners' data. And so there's that reputation issue as well. Well, how do we address ransomware? I know you've all heard, make sure you have good backups so that if your files get encrypted, you can restore from backup and you can avoid having to pay the ransom, right? So backups essentially fix the problem for standard ransomware. But for post-compromise ransomware, if the attacker has stolen your data, the backups are good for helping with the encrypted files, but the backups don't get your data, your stolen data back from the attacker. So the backups are a partial fix, but not a full fix to the attack. And in the end, if you add all these together, the ransom amounts that we saw in 2018 and 2019, you've heard stories of companies who were pre-buying Bitcoin just so in case there was a ransomware attack, they could respond to it quickly. With post-compromise ransomware, we now see ransoms in the millions or sometimes even the tens of millions of dollars. The attackers have really figured out what's important to the business, and they've gotten vicious, and they are going after what's important to the business, and they're using leverage to do that. But 2020 has been a year of new normals. This is a new normal as well. If you're hit by ransomware before, the business impact was a service disruption. Today, if you're hit by ransomware, very likely it means it's a data breach. And it's interesting who attackers are threatening when they extort the victims, who they're threatening to share data with. So we've seen attackers threaten to share data with local media sources. So when they extort the victim, they say, we will contact these media sources. Here's the data, a copy of the data which we've stolen from you that we will share with those media sources. They threaten to contact regulators. The attackers can threaten to contact your customers. If you're a B2B, you have business partner customers, that may be concerning to them as well, or maybe even share that stolen data with your competitors, right? So you can see that the business impact of this is very different than a random machine being used to check, used for reading email, having its files encrypted. And because of this, boards are really taking notice of the ransomware risk. This is a report from April of this year. Ransomware is mentioned in over 1,000 SEC, that's the Security and Exchange Commission, a regulator out of the United States, over the past year. So companies are listing ransomware as a forward-looking risk in their SEC documentation. So what are some of the recent incidents of ransomware? Well, this is quite recent, October of this year. CIO.com says that India becomes the second most targeted country for ransomware after surge attack in the last 3 months. So, with attacks happening and very prevalent in the news, some get reported and some don't. But India is not excluded from this threat and this scourge of ransomware as well. In September of this year, a really concerning story came to light, and this was ransomware that had hit a hospital in Germany and brought some of their systems down, and the hospital couldn't admit or process patients because of this service disruption. And as ambulances were coming in, they said, you have to go to the next nearest hospital. We can't admit these patients. And as a result of that, one patient even passed away because they couldn't get the care that they needed in time. So we talk about IT assets and the impact of IT assets, but more and more our lives and our societies depend on these technologies, and the impact can be quite serious. Just a few weeks later, at the end of September, a U.S. major hospital chain was hit by ransomware as well. They said that all of their computers were completely shut down. This was a Fortune 500 company with over 400 healthcare facilities, over 90,000 employees. So just imagine the chaos and impact on the business from an attack like that. Shipping firms, all right? So shipping firms have been hit as well. You may remember the story a few years back of one of the shipping firms being massively impacted to the tune of multiple hundreds of millions of dollars of impact as a result of that attack. Now, all 4 of the world's largest shipping firms have been impacted, right? So the attackers don't really care what industry you're in. They only care about making money from these attacks. So that's a lot of bad news. What are some of the things that companies can do, and what advice in just the remaining few minutes do I have to offer you about how to address this problem? Well, ransomware is a lot easier to prepare for than to respond to. And so look for ransomware services. These are services, they don't take very long. They can do they take about a week. They can be done on premise or remotely. And they should address all aspects of ransomware. Your architecture, of course, but also how would you respond to a ransomware attack? How would you do crisis communications? How would you recover from a ransomware attack? All of that should be assessed, not just the technical security controls. And lastly, I wanted to offer to you a white paper from FireEye. This white paper doesn't come at any cost, so you can download it freely. I've put a QR code on the slide to make that a little bit easier for you. The white paper is called Ransomware Protection and Containment Strategies. And this is written by our Mandiant teams who have responded to countless ransomware attacks. They've seen the measures that are effective in dealing with and defending against and preventing ransomware, and they've put those suggestions in this white paper. I think this is probably one of the best white papers I've seen come from FireEye in my years here. The suggestions are quite technical, quite specific, and very likely suggestions you have not heard of or considered before. So I think there's very fresh and very useful information in this white paper. I encourage everyone to take a look at it and to apply the recommendations inside their organization. And with that, I'm out of time. I'd like to say thank you very much for attending the session. If you'd like to learn more about how FireEye can help you with ransomware, please reach out to us. Thank you so much.